Hi guys, today's lesson is going to be on using lab equipment safely and properly. Your learning intention says that you're going to identify the names and uses for lab equipment, and to be successful you should be able to use that lab equipment properly and safely in the lab. The first thing we're going to talk about is an electronic balance. Electronic balances are pretty simple to use. They're the easiest kind of balance to use. All you have to do is turn them on, wait for it to come to zero, put your chemical on the plate, and then it'll give you a readout either in grams or ounces. We usually use grams because that's the SI unit for mass. The other type of balance is called a triple beam balance. You've probably seen one of these before. It's a little more complicated to use, but it's good for measuring larger masses. We don't use electronic balances for large masses, but when we have a large mass, we put it on a triple beam balance. You can measure it by putting it on the plate, just like with the electronic balance, and then moving these masses until it actually zeroes out over here. And we'll have another lesson on how to do that. This next piece of equipment we're going to use is the beaker. The beaker is a lot like a measuring cup. It's just like a measuring cup in many ways, and it has marks on the side that tell you how many milliliters of liquid you have in the beaker. The next thing we're going to use is the graduated cylinder. It's a little bit more complicated than the beaker because the graduated cylinder has to be read at the meniscus. Now, you might have already heard about the meniscus. The meniscus is the curved line that is created whenever water is held in a cylindrical container. And if you look very carefully, you may be able to detect the meniscus in this graduated cylinder. It's hard to do on a video. But you can see where the light is reflecting off the water, and it sort of looks sort of funky. Well, that's what we're seeing. Right there is where you measure the volume of a liquid in the graduated cylinder, the bottom of the curve. So you've got to get your eye down on the level with the curve so that you can see exactly how much it is. If you don't, you might think it's the wrong volume. Now, I measured this and I found it to be 90 milliliters because the bottom of the curve is exactly on the 90 milliliter line. If you were to read it from where the side of the water is, you'd say it was 91 milliliters, and that might not make a big difference in physical science lab, but if you were an actual chemist, it would make a big difference. You could have lots of error. So we got to make sure we read a volume in the graduated cylinder from the bottom of the curve. The next piece of equipment we're going to use is the pipette or the dropper. This is a pretty simple piece of equipment. Looks like this, just like any dropper you might have seen. Squeeze it, put it in the chemical, let go of the bulb, and then you'll have a dropper full of liquid that you can move from one place to another. One of the ways we use this is with a micro well. This is a micro well plate, and I put some food coloring and water in there just so you could see it a little bit better. If you take the dropper, you put it into the micro well, and you release the dropper, you're going to pull up a lot of liquid, and one of these micro well plates holds about as much as one of these can hold, a little bit less actually, and you can move it from one place to another. You can either move it to a test tube or a beaker or a flask or whatever you're using, or to another well. And you can see that now we have 3 wells that have liquid in them. These are just small indentations, and the reason we use one of these is to keep from wasting a lot of chemicals by using beakers full of chemicals to react. So we have a small reaction, we can still observe what's going on, but we don't have to use a lot of chemicals to do it. So that's what we use the micro well and the pipette for. The next piece of equipment is the one that made me think of science when I was your age. When I thought of science, I thought test tubes. This is a test tube, pretty simple. And this is the test tube rack. It has places to put test tubes while you're putting chemicals in. And when you're finished, you wash your test tubes and you turn them upside down. You can see this is a washed one just recently. And that's where you put them to dry. Once they're finished drying, you can put them back upright in the test tube rack and use them again. The next thing is a piece of equipment that a lot of people think looks like a pair of scissors. It's a pair of tongs. This is used to move hot items from one place to another. It can't be something heavy. It has to be something really small. So we use these from time to time. It's not often that we use them, but we do. And we use them especially when we have used a hot plate. That's the next piece of equipment that you need to be familiar with. Now, hot plates are sort of dangerous because they're plugged into the wall. Of course, if we spill water on the electrical outlet, that's not a good thing. So you got to be careful around them. But also because you can't tell when this is hot. You can't tell because it's coated with this, I think it's a ceramic coating, and it keeps you from seeing that it's hot. So you got to make sure that it's been off for a while, and you've got to make sure that you just put your hand close to the hot plate so that you can tell if it's hot or not. If it's too hot, you've got to wait for a while before you touch it. In fact, we'll probably leave these off and unplugged when we're finished using them for a complete day before we put them away, just to be sure that we're not going to get burned. All right, and of course, these are controlled just like any old oven or stovetop. High, medium, and low temperatures so that you can adjust how you add heat to a chemical or a material. We will use these once or twice at the beginning of the year and some more later on in the year. The next thing we're going to talk about is the ring stand. This is a ring stand. It's very rarely used in our physical science lab, but you will be encountering them when you go into chemistry, your junior year. And the ring stand comes apart. There's a spoke here that screws into the base, and the base sits on the tabletop. You can put a beaker here, you can put a Bunsen burner here, whatever it is that you need. And then you have a clay triangle at the top, and the clay triangle is usually used to hold something called a crucible. A crucible might remind you of a pharmacy sign, but it's not the same thing, but it might remind you of that. But a crucible sits in here, and then we can heat it with a flame, and sometimes that causes a reaction, and sometimes that just dries out a chemical. But this is what the ring stand is for heating items above a Bunsen burner or flame. And this is called the ring clamp. The next thing we're going to talk about is the stirring rod. And the stirring rod looks like it might just be a piece of plastic. It's really thick and it's pretty see-through. And you might think that you just stir with it and that's no big deal. But sometimes you use it to move items around or crush some small items, small chemicals, so that they have more surface area. But usually you do use it to stir it. Now you got to be careful with stirring with a stirring rod because you do not want to hit the sides. Because if you're hitting the sides and there's a weak spot in the glass, it could crack and cause problems. The glass would drop into your chemicals and it could cut you. So you want to make sure you're not smacking it against the side. You want to stir gently in the middle of the solution, not slamming it against the bottom, not slamming it against the sides. Always make sure you're careful with stirring rods. When you are using glassware and chemicals or heat, you are going to be wearing safety equipment. Safety equipment includes goggles and apron. Now we will be cleaning the goggles. Quick lesson on cleaning goggles. You're going to use an alcohol swab, and you're going to take the goggles and you're going to take the wet alcohol swab and you're going to swab just the parts that are going to go against your face. And every time you put them on and every time you take them off, you're going to do this. And this kills any germs, bacteria, anything that might be on there left from the last person that used them, so that you don't share germs. That's all there is to it. You're just going to do that part. You do not want to clean this part unless it's necessary. If this part needs to be cleaned, I'll be glad to clean that for you so that you don't have to look through smudges. Be easier to see that way. What's next? Well, as you can see, we have Unit 1 Formative 1. You're going to go on your Chromebook or your Google Drive, and you're going to take the Unit 1 Formative 1 quiz. Excuse me, Formative 1. On the Formative 1, you will be asked to identify some equipment by their pictures. And once you're able to do that successfully, then you're going to go take a lab equipment quiz, also on your Google Drive. Once you're finished with the lab equipment quiz and you have scored 80 or better, then you could proceed to the lab activity on volume. You'll go into the lab and you'll measure the volume of an irregularly shaped object. I hope you learned a lot, and if you need to review the video as many times as you need before you take your Formative 1 and your lab equipment quiz.